40 years of China's opening and reform. I look back, remembering the changes. In 1981, I came here as a student. I became a lawyer and economist, working with China ever since. I advised foreign investors entering China and worked with the Chinese government, drafting the regulations that made it happen. In the 1990s, with globalization, I helped China reform state-owned enterprises, turning them into multinational corporations that would compete on the global stage. In the past decades, I advised on environmental policy that would help China become the world's leader on renewable energy. I have not just observed, but also participated in each stage of China's reform and opening. Now, it's time to tell the story of these past 40 years of reform and opening that has made China the global economy that it is today. It is not about looking back, but learning how we got here and looking toward the future that we will create together. Join me, Laurence Brahm, for China, 40 years of reform and opening and marathon talks with behind-the-scenes stories from the experts and innovators who are the change that China will be. Hi, I'm Laurence Brahm.
I'm Yang Xinmeng.
And welcome to China Reform and Opening, 40 years in perspective.
Thank you for joining us in this special program. Today is the second episode of our live streaming marathon.
And we're going to be looking at the China economic model. Is it socialist or is it capitalist? What do you think, Xinmeng?
Well, I think China is China. It's unique.
It's unique because it's a unique model and merger of planning and market to create solutions for problems and challenges and to make people's lives just a little bit better.
Well, to set the stage for tonight, we have this brief introduction to you.
Capitalism versus socialism. The two different political, economic, and social systems are adopted by different countries around the world, and the choices of the system tell us a great deal about how a country functions. Private property or state ownership, free market or government regulation, social safety net or survival of the fittest. There's an ongoing debate about which of the two systems is better. There are questions about how to define socialism and capitalism. There are also controversies about whether a country like China is socialist or capitalist. Since China started its reform and opening up 40 years ago, market forces have been let loose, and other capitalist elements have been introduced. The private sector has subsequently boomed. Is China still a socialist country? Is the market economy only a feature of capitalism? Does the planned economy only belong to socialism? China calls its system socialism with Chinese characteristics. Is that the right way to describe it?
Who do we have tonight?
We've just got an incredible lineup tonight of guests. We've got communists, socialists, capitalists, everybody's represented on this show. So let's introduce our guests.
Okay.
I'd like to begin by introducing William Low, who's a film producer and founder of William Low Productions, Shanghai.
Zhang Xiaoyu, professor of South Asian Studies at Communication University of China. And that's where I graduated. Thank you for joining us.
David Mahan, Managing Director at Mahan Investment Management in China.
And Aggie Veres, Country Director for UNDP China. Welcome.
And Charles Liu, founder of How Capital. We're going to begin this evening by asking William to reflect back on the days, I believe, when the communists first came to Shanghai. You were a little boy, and you remember, can you reflect back on those changes?
Yes, I remember I was 5 years old, I think, when the Chinese People's Army marched into China. I went to look for it, went to the streets, and everybody was happy and dancing. So la so la do la do so do la so mi le mi. 秧歌舞. Okay, now your subject today, I heard earlier, So talking about the system, economic system, whether it be a capitalist or socialist. May I ask you, Laurence, you're a specialist, you're economist. How do you define properly the difference between the Chinese socialists with characteristics, with Chinese characteristics?
The concept of socialism, socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics. You're asking how to define that. Well, one of the things we have to remember is it's a combination of socialism, which involves planning, and the market, and really not worrying about whether it's one or the other, but getting the job done. And I think the key to this is Chinese characteristics. Because if we look at Chinese, not only in China, but all over the world, Chinese culture is defined by entrepreneurship, innovation, hardworking, diligence, and investing in the education of one's children for the future generation. I think that's really what it's all about. And talking about education, now, Xiaoyu, you're a professor at Communications University, and I believe you're also a young Communist Party member. Is that right?
Yes, I am.
You're probably the coolest looking communist that I've ever met.
Actually, I joined the Communist Party of China when I was 18 years old. Actually, my generation, we are born in 1990s. So we quite, people, especially foreign people, think in our generation, probably young people have studied abroad, they will not adhere to the Chinese philosophy or Communist Party's ideology. But the truth is, in my generation, we young people really trust the party, trust the country, have very huge confidence in our own culture and the motherland. So I think in the education field, what we have taught students, according to my experience, and we got reflection about what we have got graduates, is young people at the moment, they have great confidence and also have a huge adherence to Chinese policies and in modern society. Yes, that's what I feel.
David, you've been around China as long as I have, if not longer, and you've brought...
You've been 6 years longer than me.
Okay, well, you've been doing a lot of investment, mergers, acquisition, dealing with stressed assets. How do you find working in a mixed economic system?
Well, I think coming to China, you assume that there is a process that's really been happening since the 80s, which is a gradual privatization. The state gradually slipping into a relationship with the private sector, transferring assets, state-owned banks financing that process. Whereas most countries where you have a strong state system, it's in opposition, in a sense, to the private market. And in other countries, if you think of Indonesia perhaps in the 80s, you also have a military-industrial system that's in opposition. Whereas in China, both state and private have the same objectives, which is to growth in the economy and the continued commonwealth. If you think of the party officials, if you think of the government people, and we deal with them in small towns in China, in sort of second and third and fourth tier cities, their motives politically are to deliver economic growth. In that sense, everyone's on the same page. So I think terms like communism as an economic portal or aperture to look through, or even capitalism, kind of distort the picture here. This is a country that is a market economy that's got a focus for economic growth and commonwealth. And in the last 35 years, I've seen that continuing wave after wave. So it has its own particular dynamic. And I think the characteristics you identified are clearly there. But there's something else here. And the fundamental thing is there's an aspiration in this population. And it's not an ideological one. It is a love of culture. It is a sense of, as we're seeing now in the trade war environment, there's a galvanization of Chinese people. You bully us, we stick together. And that's very much a deep Chinese instinct. So our experience is that this is a better market to deal in than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The courts work better. The companies are far more sophisticated. In some sectors, when you go into Geely, wonderful company, you walk into the automotive future. Nothing in America would match what is currently produced in Hangzhou Bay. So it's a very exciting, dynamic economy. And I think the sense generally is that it's hard to make money and do business anywhere. And foreigners tend to blame Chinese cultural aspects or political aspects for things that are just normal commercial impediments. But this is a good market to work in general.
You've talked about innovation, transformation, social change. Aggie, you are the UNDP representative here. What about social change? The UN has these 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Is China on track toward those goals? What your assessment?
I think it's hard to tell. It's too early to tell if anybody is on track with the goals. But I think what matters in the case of China is that whatever happens in China matters for the world. So it's not just for China to achieve the development goals for Chinese development that impacts China, but it has just an enormous impact on everything. If you think about environment, climate change, disaster management, poverty reduction, and economic growth, what this development agenda is about is bringing all this together, not just improve and expand the economy, but do it in a way that's environmentally and socially sustainable and that actually creates social and environmental benefits, including global public goods. So if you look at it that way, I think even in my relatively short time in China, I think that there have been a lot of change and a lot of policies, a lot of cultural and approach change in the Chinese public and government and businesses that are a good indication that China is on track to do as much as possible. But in terms of the outcome, I think that's still to be seen.
Now, social and environmental benefits. Now, Charles Liu, you're the founder of How Capital. You've been investing in these years. How many companies in China?
38.
38 companies. Okay, and tell me, if you're going to be doing private equity investment now, would you think of yourself being in China, socialist China, as a red capitalist or a green capitalist?
I think green finance is something that one really has to look at very seriously now, because China is moving rapidly into becoming probably the leading force on environmental protection and new renewable sources of energy in the world. Last year, more than 50% of the solar panels installed in the world were installed in China. 80% of the world's production of solar panels is in China. More than 50% of the global electric vehicles were manufactured and sold in China. So it's becoming an industry. It's no longer just protection of the environment. Mm-hmm. It's not one-off cases. I think this is something that I see now in my investments in China. There's no question that China will be a leading force. Three Gorges Group, $100 billion for remediation of the Three Gorges area. COFCO, $100 billion to do soil remediation, to get rid of the metals in the soil, in the land, mm-hmm. and overuse of chemical fertilizers. You have serious government policy directives, 8,000 some environmental inspectors from the central government checking all over the place. I think this is good for the rest of the world, especially when there is another country which is now talking about opening up more coal mines. And you know, at the UN conference, there is a stand from a certain country that talks about let coal go.
You can say America if you like. You know. That's all right.
You know, it's,
well, you know, you open up a host of different questions just by talking about the environment and repair. It seems that there's investment into the repair of the environment.
Right.
And before we go on, I just want to mention, last night our conversation was all about ecological civilization, mm-hmm. a policy I led the drafting work with Zhu Yanlai.
Right.
And actually, you were very, very helpful when we were forming those early policy documents, helping us to understand the dynamics of finance behind repairing the environment. Mm-hmm. And David, I mean, how much of investment do you see now going into environment, into new technologies? You mentioned the auto industry, smart infrastructure. Tell us.
I think in terms of battery technology for cars, China is now moving towards a leading edge. I think also one of the things that has been most profound is the terrible pollution in Beijing for years. And people joke there's going to be a change and there's a new policy. And in the last 18 months, traveling to the bottom of places like Shandong, going to factories that are old factories. I mean, a lot of our business that we deal with is older businesses, somewhat broken investments. And in many of these cities, anyone who was not using gas had to turn their factory off. So there's been a profound change. And I think that kind of commitment to almost economic pain in areas where, you know, you would imagine in most countries they'd be too worried about what the popular view was. There is an overriding principle here of environment and health. And I think that China is dedicated to it. But also, it's because it's a social issue. I mean, this is the People's Republic of China. We have a very good leadership at the moment. You know, a lot of contentious issues in terms of foreigners' minds, but after 3 decades here, we have very strong, very stable leadership with good principles. But they're listening to what the people want. And it was the people that wanted to change an environment. So there is no way that this Communist Party is not going to see that as one of the pillars of their own performance. So it really is happening here from a grassroots.
As a capitalist, I would say there's something else tied into this. If you look at the chemical factories that were shut down in Shandong, for example, if they didn't deal with environmental issues, it means they're using old technology, they're using really, really cheap raw material, and they are inefficient. So shutting down on the basis of environmental protection of a number of these factories and dismantling them is getting rid of inefficient, old, excess capacity.
That's true, very much.
And it's really, it's absolutely amazing how much this is accelerating. But there's an interesting aspect to what I described as creating an industry of environmental protection, water remediation. It's actually taken much beyond what the tree huggers, you know, we joke about this, the Greenpeace of this world goes after. It's actually creating industries which will be passed along on One Belt, One Road in other countries as well.
So you get a lot of criticisms from outside of China about planning or about intervention into the market, but actually it's this intervention or this guiding or encouraging of the market to address these issues of environment. I mean, Aggie, how do you see that from the perspective of every year the UN has your UNFCCC annual climate change talks, negotiations, but it seems a lot of countries are looking at China that's sort of following its own path.
No, absolutely. I think what you're saying is exactly right, because these kinds of interventions bring transformation. If you want to address climate change in China and beyond, the little adjustments are not going to work. The latest reports on climate change are clear that basically we are not going to achieve the goals. In fact, even with what we're doing, we're going to make it worse. So in that sense, the only way to do that is accelerate. And what can accelerate is innovation and technology and change of behaviors. I believe change of behaviors takes really a lot and generations. So innovation and technology is key to this. So these kinds of intervention and encouragement, incentives to change technologies, for example, what you mentioned on transportation, is going to be key. There are clear studies showing that, for example, what takes 1 week in China in terms of innovation developing takes 3 weeks in anywhere else, including the US. So if we look at that, I think this is the place where what we need to find is how to apply these kinds of potential that China has to offer to address these issues. And this is the linkage that hasn't been fully established yet.
Education, the next generation, and that was a big part of the ecological civilization policy, was awareness teaching and all the technical transformations of education. Now you're in education. How do you see ecology, environment, awareness as a Communist Party priority in the education system today?
Yeah, so this is a very good question, though. Mr. Liu has mentioned we have created a lot of sort of a technology and very green source car. For instance, the BYD car, which is very popular in China at the moment. Actually, students, especially younger generation, they have paid a great attention to the environmental issues at the moment, especially in Beijing. Actually, youngsters now, they are doing lots of innovation. For instance, we have built great funding for this, for people to think about how to cure the environmental issues. And students also go abroad to do research, how these countries, especially developed countries, have to deal with the issue. They also have gone to developing countries to look at what is going on over there. For instance, in India, which is very heavily polluted, in Pakistan, very heavily polluted as well. So these countries are in a Belt and Road Initiative partnerships with China. So at the moment, these countries are looking at China and seeking some technology from our experience. And we can share with the world, especially young people can take sort of responsibility to borrow experience and to share experience with others. So this is the situation in China at the moment, I think.
You know, looking back at how China brought foreign investment in and began to learn from the outside, I'll never forget reflecting back to the late 80s in Shanghai when Zhu Rongji was then mayor. And William, I believe you and I went to see Zhu Rongji in Shanghai when he was mayor, and he talked about what's called the "一条龙服务," one dragon line of facilitating foreign investment. He actually talked about bringing all the different government departments into one room so that investment could be quicker, faster, more efficient.
About efficiency.
I think you have a picture of yourself.
Yes. This is a picture reminds me of how we met in Shanghai when Mayor Zhu Rongji was the mayor of Shanghai for his first trip to the United States. And American Chamber of Commerce held a luncheon to welcome him. And he was very, very impressive. He stood up and delivered a speech, excellent speech, without any write-up preparation. I was there. I was so impressed. I went up to him and I introduced myself. And that's a picture that was taken by the AmCham photographer.
William, you haven't changed much at all.
No.
Same glasses.
Much older.
I was with you. I was in the room then. I was part of that delegation. I remember that. I remember that Zhu Rongji came into the room when he first received us. There was a reception when he was explaining the investment protocols, and he was wearing like hiking boots. And one businessman, said, "The mayor of Shanghai is not wearing shoes. He's wearing hiking boots." At the end of the meeting, he apologized. "I'm wearing hiking boots because I came in late. I was actually personally inspecting the construction of one of the foreign investment hotels to make sure the construction's on time." So, I mean, that's the kind of spirit of hands-on, leadership that has been part of the reforms that we've been witnessing.
I was very impressed because the simultaneous interpreter made a slight mistake. He made an immediate correction in English. The speech was delivered in Mandarin, but the correction was done in English. It was very impressive. When you talk about economic systems of capitalism, which is run by free enterprise system, but with Chinese socialism is with Chinese characteristics, I would like to add that it's subject to government intervention and change depending upon the circumstance. Like, for example, as I remember when I was in Hong Kong, what you call it, some people were trying to take advantage of the situation and try to short sell the Hong Kong dollars. And the Hong Kong government immediately, they called the monetary system. The monetary authority must have called up People's Bank of China and get their support. Immediately made the change. This government intervention. That's not free enterprise system. It is necessary to protect ourselves.
That was during the Asian financial crisis.
1997.
Indeed.
97, that's
I was
right.
involved.
You were involved. I think every crisis is an opportunity. The word for crisis in Chinese, weiji, means weixian, danger and opportunity. Tell us what was happening during the Asian financial crisis.
If you really look at it, you know, we don't name George Soros or Druckenmiller and so on and so forth, but it was the beginnings of the heydays of the hedge fund, taking the pound out of the peg was the first round. But then it's very simple. You short the local currency, whatever it is, Indonesian rupiah, and you buy it back when it's gotten creamed. Now, that happened in Indonesia, that happened in Thailand, that happened in the Philippines, but Mahathir, who is now Prime Minister again, at that time, had the gall and was severely criticized by Western financiers and Western governments and the IMF for putting in capital controls to prevent the raping of these economies. But I want to get back to what William was saying in terms of Chinese characteristics. You know, I think the whole concept of socialism or capitalism is really academic studies. Every country is different. Not only are they different in historical terms, cultural terms, economic terms, size terms, but also different stages of development. How can you talk about a market economy when there wasn't a market in 1979 in China? Now, if you look at, I look at my investment history in China starting in what actually projects in 1977. It's 40 plus years here. China changed so much. In the 1980s, it was really cheap labor, manufacturing, low-grade manufacturing. 1990s, higher-grade manufacturing. After 2005, 2007, it was really a question, it became a market. So now you can talk about a market because now there is a market. Before that, that wasn't a market. So there was no basis to talk about a market. So when you talk about a market economy, okay, now there's intense competition. Just supermarkets alone. You have the Singaporeans, you have Walmart, you have Carrefour, you have Metro, you have the local Chinese, the Chinese supermarket chains. Intensely competitive because now you have a market. Why? You have a middle class that consumes, that uses the market. So all of this talk out of the Western countries about, oh, no market economy, centrally planned, that's all garbage, I'm sorry to say. Because I think whatever works is what really should be used. In 1979, beginning of reform, what market? So I would say it's a false subject, you know, socialism or capitalism.
We talk about market fundamentalism. This is something that's come out of the sort of theories and the university professors who have become policymakers in Washington. But when they criticized the Asian financial crisis, Mahathir or Zhu Rongji for then stepping in and stabilizing currencies. Well, what happened in 2008 when market fundamentalism caused an entire collapse of America's market? They came in with quantitative easing, which is the Fed buying debt to create more debt to be able to print more money.
Yeah.
Isn't that intervention in its highest form?
Absolutely, absolutely. If you look at what happened in 2008, not only that, Hank Paulson came to Beijing 6 times or 7 times, begging the Chinese government to launch some stimulus programs.
And they did, and they overdid it. I mean,
4 trillion.
The great tragedy of the global financial crisis was that China was not exposed. It had no derivatives market of any account in China. It's domestically. Its banks were in reasonable condition.
That's right.
The contagion was in the global financial. It was a banking crisis, actually.
It was Wall Street.
Yeah, and to stimulate the economy, then they had to sort out the some of the overspend and waste that came through the stimulus. So the interesting thing now is there is stimulus in anticipation of the issues that may come from perhaps deeper sanctions next year. but it's on the coast in the more developed areas. Once you go inland, you go to the northeast, they are still deleveraging the banks. They're still sorting out the non-performing loans. So I think we have quite an aggressive policy at the moment to get away from the debt that was accruing, particularly starting about 4 years ago. And analysts were saying China's about to have a major crisis, debt crisis. It might have had a credit crisis and running out of sources of cash, but there wasn't a debt crisis. And one of the issues of, it's so hard to deal with investors, and I know Charles probably has to struggle with this too. People would make these big statements like, there's a housing crisis about to happen in China. Ghost cities. I mean, you remember 10 years ago, BBC, CNN, photographs of these suburbs calling them cities.
Documentaries.
And the average household in China is actually, has a very modest mortgage. The levels of debt are very low. In fact, there's still 30 to 40% savings rates. There isn't a bubble in terms of the consumer owning houses. So, yes, housing has been a little too rapid. There's been a lot of overbuild in some parts of the country. But there isn't a coming housing crisis, and there isn't a coming banking crisis.
It's not systemic. The whole issue is, if you talk about the real estate market in China, it's not systemic. Not like what happened, you have derivatives on derivatives on derivatives, and slice and dice. That's what happened in Wall Street and in London. In China, you have small bubbles here and there, but it's not a complete mortgage market with slice and diced subprime or other mortgages in derivatives on derivatives. And this is what David is referring to. So there are risks, of course, but it's not a systemic risk.
I need to pick up on this because you hear all the time CNBC, you turn on the news and they're saying, oh, there's a China crisis, you know, and you're dealing with stressed
20 years
assets.
they've been saying that.
What is happening? Is there going to be a huge credit crisis, a huge...
Not. The biggest risk is confidence.
Yeah.
If we have a more insane White House policy next year and 25% tariffs come on, or the current regime in the White House starts to try and tear up more international obligations that America is supposed to be committed to. If there is the deterioration of the WTO, particularly the appellate process, then there'll be an increased loss of confidence. That could begin to affect Chinese companies. And once you lose confidence in an economy, no matter how solvent you are, no matter how strong your banks are, people stop investing or they slow down employing. So you could have a slowdown. So that is a risk. It's a risk from the outside, though. It's not a risk from the internal current development of the economy of China.
Yes, actually, there is a very good phenomenon. Lots of people say that the consumption is slowing down in China. But if you look at the Singles Day, the Double 11, and you see the statistics by Alibaba, we have created billions of dollars in one single day of consumption. So lots of young people did their consumption online, and possibly people don't really notice this sort of a phenomenon, which is quite attractive, to be honest.
So are people voting in confidence with their money? I mean, you're a part of the youth in China today. Why are you confident?
Because I think the policymaker in China is quite smart. We don't do anything protectionism. Actually, we did lots of cooperation, and especially we have a sort of a successful experience considering reform and opening up. So lots of developing countries are looking at us. They want to have some good experience, and especially in infrastructure and how China have changed their people's lifestyles. For instance, I was in Bangladesh several years ago, and I visited this country for so many times. Actually, when I was there 10 years ago, people are starving over there. But now, Chinese companies go there, and they started to solve the problems, especially local problems. There are lack of roads, lack of bridges, lack of tunnels. This is the transportation thing. If the local people do not have a good access to transportation, do not have access to, especially from one district to the capital city, so how can this country get developed? So China is going there to solve the problem, and that is the especially young students, when they go abroad and see what's going on outside.
That's what a party member would say. But from a businessman's perspective, I would use something else. I would say something else. which I think is more important. Infrastructure is important. The attack on China from the United States is not an attack on China. It's an attack on the most modern, efficient, productive, lowest cost supply chain in the world. It's an attack on Asia. It's an attack on, in fact, Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. This attack, this supply chain, beats the pants off the United States and kicks the butt of the Europeans. This is a supply chain that historically has never existed in mankind in terms of its efficiency. Why China at its core? Because of China's economies of scale, its own market size. So what we have now is this has lifted billions of people off poverty, not just in China. This has given $35 smartphones to Africans and to Indians. This has allowed education, information flow to benefit the rest of the world. This has allowed cheap products for Europeans and Americans to lower their cost of living. This is what Donald Trump is attacking.
Yeah, that's why Donald Trump's, people are dissing Donald Trump, and these people are so worried about the American products, the price will go up very soon.
Aggie, Belt and Road, yes, go ahead.
Yes, beyond the Belt and Road, I think what you said, one of the things is key to me is the scale.
That's right.
Because why can China develop like that, and why has it been leapfrogging? Because it has its own market at the scale where it's economically viable. So for example, when you look at technology, you mentioned electric vehicles and so forth. Actually, China is now past that. We're talking about hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, which is the future. There are other countries that experimented with this technology, including what I found out from the ambassador from Iceland. But simply the commercialization of a new technology in the size of an Iceland just cannot be compared to the scale that can be done in China. So that's why, to me, this experience, and when we're talking about whether it's capitalist, socialist, the Chinese characteristics, there is no other country with the scale and scope that China has. So in a way, it's impossible to compare it to any other system, whether you're talking about market system or governance system or whatsoever. So this scale is what makes it possible for China to move so fast and to essentially make things work.
It's one of the reasons.
But it's a key, in my
But
view.
also, I
It's
think
very...
that you're right, because the misconception has always been that China depends on trade. And so what the White House is trying to do is attack China on trade. It's not going to work. Already, if you look at where China is now replacing what it used to buy from America, in the agricultural sector, where we've been very involved in investment and clients in the past, American soybeans are being replaced by rapeseed meal, which is in huge quantities in India. And they won't go back to American soybeans. They won't expose their farms again in terms of getting good protein into feed. But also, every 7 or 8 years, there's something about China's exports are going to be slowing. It's going to really hurt the domestic economy. It's been its trade with itself that's allowed it to build. Foreign investment's been important, very important, but China has been a domestic dynamic. And so, in the end, I think we are seeing a failing American empire. And they think that it is because of China. It's not. It's because of themselves.
That's right.
The deficit has nothing to do with China's trade. America has deficits with most countries. They are consuming, they're not investing and saving, and they don't manufacture. So they depend on a global flow of capital. They're not part of, in many cases, the supply chains don't extend through the states themselves within the US. So the emphasis is wrong. This will hurt America hugely. China will have some difficult years, but it will find its way forward. It's too interconnected, and its domestic powerhouse is too strong.
Look at the iPhone. The iPhone, for example, 270 supplier of components, 99% in Asia.
Yeah.
Can you move that to Wisconsin? And now you're going to find 50,000 workers trained to assemble and make the iPhone?
But I have a question here, because we're very focused on the China-US relationship in this regard. So you're asking whether you can move this to Wisconsin, but my question is, can you move it to Africa, for example? Like, are we looking at a change in the entire global structure because of this?
Difficult. I think it's very, very difficult.
It takes an average of 2 years to actually scope out, choose your investment site, commission a factory, and be up and in production. 2 years is a long time. So what's going to happen? The view is maybe there will be a deal next year. And as a result, this will not be such an intense trade war. Everyone's watching and waiting. So you can't just move house when it comes to the very subtle and very intricate supply chains. And even if they do, what the factory that produces that widget depends on 12 other factories. And that's the part you can't shift to Vietnam or Mexico or to Africa. Eventually, there will be diversification, and many companies will think of the future struggle between America and China and do that. But fundamentally, it is too intricate, it is too interconnected here. And China's just part of the pathway.
That's right.
So it's...
As the White House is sort of alienating a lot of countries, including some of its closest partners and friends, are we going to then see this super efficient, innovative supply chain, investment chain that's been the evolution of China's own mixture of planning and market and vision, expanding out into the other countries, what we call the Belt and Road, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Africa? Are we going to see an integrated model occurring as a result in some ways because
That's
of all this?
globalization. You can't stop it. What U.S. might want to do, what the U.S. might want to do is to have two of everything. You have a factory, Foxconn factory in Wisconsin, and Foxconn factory in Zhengzhou. But that is the antithesis of enhancing efficiency for the world.
Just coming back to, sort of the vision of leadership here, because a lot of these ideas of extreme market fundamentalism were coming from theorists, from people who actually were not in business, were not really, running economies or running even cities. But William, I saw a picture there that you had of a much younger Wang Qishan when he was running a bank. So could you show that to us?
Yes. Wang Qishan, when I met him, he was president of the Bank of Construction.
Oh, which one is Mr. Wang?
It's true.
The young man.
Oh,
Which one? The handsome one.
the handsome one. Because people wear glasses, so it's not easy to recognize their faces.
What year was this?
I don't remember the year. I was young too,
Okay.
but he's younger than me. But I don't know, maybe by a year or two. But actually now he worked so hard. I read from the magazines, there were some 27 attempts of assassination of him.
Oh.
I don't know how true that is, but that's what I read from the
I think one of the things that we see here is that, he was running a bank. He was at one point mayor. He was in charge of the Office for Reform of Economic Systems. So actually before
No. This Wang Qishan. Wang Qishan was never the mayor.
He was mayor of Beijing. And then later.
Much later.
And then governor of Hainan before that. And so before he reached the central government, he had kind of done everything. And I think it's this kind of level of pragmatism, hands-on, running a city, running a province, running a financial institution that gives somebody the ability to sort of sit there and look out on problems and solve them in a very pragmatic way.
Rather than experience in reality shows.
That's right.
He was deputy governor of the Central Bank, People's Bank of China, before he became president.
But that experiential thing is, William, is very important, because you go back through Chinese history, and there is that point when meritocracy, and was it the Yuan dynasty? It was a point where it was about merit, it was not family, it was not birth. And the exam system was a way of, even a commoner could become an official. And the quality that is still strong here is, you don't get to become the magistrate of a bigger county if you haven't done something profound and useful in the county you're magistrate of in the first place. You think of Xi Jinping and his first job in Hebei. He had to perform. Then he had to perform in Fujian. Then he had to perform in Zhejiang. You don't get there because you're someone's kid, and you don't get there purely on relationships. And we might look at the American system with the Bushes and the Clintons, almost that kind of return to royalty, even though they had a revolution. Was the one thing that is true in China. It's a ruthless process of meritocratic rise. If you don't understand economics, if you don't understand social management, you don't get the next big job. You're pushed sideways. So I think it's not about, this is something that's innate to Chinese culture. It's not specific to the current leadership or communism. It's innate to Chinese culture.
Yeah, that's why Chinese young people are so confident about the party and the country, because if young people can get opportunities to do what they want to do, people will be happy with it. For instance, before the reform and opening up, if young people study abroad, for instance, in the United States, they probably would not want to come back and do something service to the country, because they thought there were more opportunities in the developed countries. But at the moment, in my generation, people go abroad, study abroad, get a proper degree in prominent universities. They are very eager to come back to the country and to serve the country, serve the party, to do whatever they can do to make this country develop more.
Is that confidence in your culture?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, for instance, in my university, when I was in London, actually we have a Confucius Institute. It was not funded by the government. Actually, it was a sort of a self-funding thing. We students take part in it, and we want to do some promotion about our culture. We're never afraid of do some expressing ourselves. So we know we are different at the moment, and also the 2008 Olympic Games, I was a volunteer over there. I was quite confident because my country finally did a great achievement. We had the Olympics here in Beijing, in our capital city, and we're so happy to welcome the athletes and the tourists from all over the world, and we're happy to make friends and see each other, what's going on in the world.
If you look at my generation, which is more like William's generation, it's 1979, China's opening up and reform. The first wave was actually overseas Chinese who came back and contributed everything. But today, it's more than just that patriotism or the cultural roots. Today, young people also flock to where opportunities are.
Exactly.
I look at the Taiwanese, I'm Taiwanese, I was born in Taiwan, our investment groups. Over 90% of startups, innovation, of trying to do new things, of Taiwanese young people are in China, not in Taiwan.
Yes, absolutely agree. Because I've got a sort of a classmate from Taiwan, and my uncle did business with people from Taiwan like 20 years ago. At that time, Taiwan people have a sort of privilege, like we're richer than the mainland people. But at the moment, lots of the Taiwan authorities, children, they come to work in the mainland, and actually they don't do elections in the land anymore, and they want to come back. Actually, we don't to do anything specific, especially to do the unification of the country.
175,000, this is according to informal numbers by Taiwanese themselves. 175,000 Taiwanese engineers work in Shenzhen.
Yeah.
Wow.
But you made a point earlier, Cindy, about no protectionism. That's, I don't believe that is true. I think all countries are protectionist if they can get away with it. Protect your own domestic market, because people feel vulnerable to international forces. Your own industry. And if you look at the problems China's now facing globally on trade, not just with America, but also with Europe, where the view is it has not been open enough fast enough. When China joined the WTO, it was 17th economy in the world. It's now second, or if by purchasing power parity, perhaps first. It has been too slow in terms of opening its financial system.
No, the development has been too quick. China's development has been too fast. I wouldn't say it's been too slow. Sorry to interrupt.
I'm not saying the development's too slow, but if they'd opened their financial system, they would have actually facilitated the underlying growth that has been very fast.
I'm in the finance business.
So am I.
Yes.
We'll find a middle way, because one of the things about China's system, I think you mentioned the culture, and William, I think culture is a very important route for you too, coming, back to Shanghai after you went to Hong Kong. How important is the cultural factor in finding a middle way in terms of the economics?
Actually, go back to the origin, the central policy of China, I think, is one to make the world a better place for all people to live. And so is America. But somehow, government is managed by people, depending upon the changes of their principal motives. They want selfishness or selflessness. Like, for example, Xi Jinping, Chairman Xi Jinping, his selflessness. He's wanted people and the whole world to benefit, not only develop China, but let the whole world. The one road, one belt, one road. Excuse me, whichever way. The idea is to share the benefits of the growth and development together, not me, China first.
I think as we have a trade war, a lot of this is a zero-sum mentality that you sometimes come out of a system where it's one party or the other has to win, or one side or the other. But here in China, I think one of the fundamental aspects of the culture that affects the evolution of the economic model is one of a middle way. We talk about in Taoism a middle way, in Buddhism a middle way. And actually, Xinmeng, can you tell us a little bit about the culture that underlies the middle way of economics?
Well, I think in Chinese culture, it's about harmony. It's, yin and yang. Yin and yang is everything. It's black and white, but it's not creating conflicts. It's about harmony, like you said. It describes how, seemingly opposite or contrary forces may actually be complementary, interconnected, and interdependent. So according to this policy, everything has its yin and yang aspects, and it's all about balance. Now here we have a video to show how to balance the planning and the market.
In most social sciences theories, property and businesses in capitalist economies are owned and controlled by individuals. Governments play a minimal role in deciding important economic decisions, leaving the cost of goods and services to market forces. While in a socialist economy, the government owns and controls the major means of production, and the approach is also called centralized planning. Capitalism is unconcerned about equity. The argument is that inequality is the driving force of innovation and economic development. In contrast, the primary concern of the socialist model is a redistribution of wealth and resources from the rich to the poor. This is to ensure everyone has equal opportunities. As for the price of goods, a capitalist economy relies on free markets to determine it, while a socialist economy uses government intervention. When it comes to efficiency, in capitalism, it is argued that the profit incentive encourages firms to be more efficient. That's because if firms fail to keep up, they will go out of business. In socialism, state ownership can arguably lead to inefficiency, because without the motivation to earn more money, workers are less likely to put extra effort into developing new ideas or products. Are these elements the defining factors of socialism and capitalism? Do these notions and theories fit in today's reality?
You were just talking to me just now about something about rocks and rivers. What was that all about?
摸着石头过河. This is trial and error. Identify the problems and resolve the problem according to the problem, the conditions of the problem, and identify the problems and solve the problem. This is, like you said, we didn't have a market economy before. It started brand new with Chinese characteristics. That's what it really means.
Pragmatism.
Just to add to that, because we haven't touched upon, you were talking about how China was developing, whether there was a market or not a market, and then the individual meritocracy and the experimentation. But my understanding is that one of the reasons why China developed so well in this regard, because of this spirit of experimentation at the level of something that can be taken to scale. So for example, starting with the special economic zones, and then trying to see what works, what doesn't work, going back to you, whether it's capitalist, socialist, doesn't matter. We're experimenting with something in a confined space, and if that works, we're going to take it to scale. If it doesn't work, we're going to put it to side. And I think this approach is what showed a lot of development in China. In fact, I have a picture here, a very interesting one. You know, UNDP has been in China for almost 40 years, just 1 year after the reforms, in 1979. So we have this book of 40 years in China, 39 years, sorry. And one of the first projects we had in 1980 was supporting the special economic zones, where UNDP did the first study tour that Jiang Zemin, the former, I mean, we all know who he is, at the time participated in this study tour, and he quoted that this gave him some of the ideas of taking this approach forward. So I think, you know, some of these little things that happened and give a spark and an idea that somehow have been very many milestones like this in China over the years.
You just opened up a whole question because, you know, you were talking about the Yuan dynasty and how they've just brought everybody in from all over the world because of meritocracy. And actually, I think in the development of a lot of economic models in China, it's been about looking at different systems and experimenting. During the debt crisis, they were looking at the American model, the Swedish model, and it's really about picking and choosing and not worrying about the ideology. It's just like what works best for us.
Don't you think, though, Laurence, that because of the global financial crisis, there was a loss of confidence in China because they were looking at aspects of the American system, and for the flaws of the American system as a bureaucratic phenomenon, it has some of the best agencies in the world. You think of its Department of Agriculture, its Food and Drug Administration. I mean, America has some very, very finely developed systems. And China was looking at that. I remember being on a bus to a plane in Shanghai in 1992. And there was a woman next to me who was American. And she was part of an exchange group of the Department of Statistics with the Ministry of Statistics here. As far back as that, there was this dialogue. How do we do data better? How do we measure our own country more efficiently? And America was part of the paradigm, hidden aspects. A lot was taken from Europe as well. The global financial crisis caused a bit of a small crisis of confidence in Beijing because they thought, well, what's happening to our model? If they'd thought it through, it was actually a bunch of greedy bankers, a bunch of ungoverned individuals, an act of global corruption that probably hasn't been matched since the Great Depression. When people talk about corruption in China, let's think back to the Western corruption of 2008. And I think that there was a slowing in terms of thinking, well, how can we apply these things? As you say, borrowing from all. There's now a greater confidence here. And I think that there is a much greater sense that, okay, you might screw up the system that we've respected, but we can do better with that. We can take this technology, as China has done in so many cases, and make it our own. And I think systemically they're beginning to do that. They're doing it with more discernment and far less, perhaps there was a bit too much adoration of the American and European system. But the one thing that interests me most is that in this current crisis and in the American relationship, the emphasis is on Europe. Europe is, in a sense, a more compatible economy. The amount of investment into Europe from China is double that of what goes into the United States. There's still great industrial innovation in Europe at a level that China needs in all sorts of areas, in the medical sector, aviation. So the complementarity between Europe as a trading bloc and China is actually much greater and more immediate than the US. So as Donald Trump does his sort of cheap, low-cost Mussolini thing, China's turning and being far more discerning and quite bold. So I think this will help Europe too in its own difficulties, that the relationship with China economically could start to bring about some real change there.
Xinmeng, let me ask you a question. Now, when you go out on a date for Michelin dining, and you have a kind of a linguine pasta, do you ever think about having to have a quota certificate in order to be able to eat?
A quota for what? Why would I have a quota in a Michelin restaurant?
Your father's generation had it.
Exactly. Do you remember the 两票?
粮票.
粮票.
How many of you remember that? You must remember that.
Yeah, of course.
Remember the 两票?
I know that,
布票,
but I've never
粮票.
used it.
Well, explain what a 两票 is to us.
You're not allowed, even if you had money, to buy something without a coupon that allows you
Cooking
to buy
oil, rice.
Yeah, cooking oil, rice, cloth even. This is
right, yeah.
1960s and 70s.
Rationing quotas
Rationing quota.
in an economy of scarcity. Now, what is China today?
We can
Abundance.
buy whatever we want, especially younger
I
generations.
think, you know, if you really, there are a couple of numbers which will really reflect on what has happened in the last half a century. 35 years ago, the per capita GDP of India was $1 less than China. Today is 1/5 of China. China is 500% of India. Half a century ago, over 80% of the population were illiterate, uneducated, never went to school. Today, illiteracy rate is less than 10%.
Even 5% probably,
Yeah, less than 5%.
according to the latest statistics.
It depends on how you calculate illiteracy.
Yeah.
Because for a student of South Asia, you know how literacy
Yes,
is
I know
measured
that.
in
Because
India.
if you can,
right?
if you can spell your name, then you are literate.
You are literate.
Yeah.
So what has happened, you know, I want to go back to what David was talking about before, and that I think is really quite important. Western countries today, look at China today, don't really think about how fast the process has been in the last 3 decades. Donald Trump and some others talk about China as no longer a developing country. On a per capita basis, it is very much a developing country. They worked very hard. They strove to improve the livelihood of its people, and it's happened. And now, for someone as a bystander or participant in the process, it's almost as if, well, you've succeeded, so now you're to be punished. You know, this is the absurdity of what's coming out of Washington and a few other places.
Well, as an illustration of that vast transformation and success, we're talking about liangpiao, which was our generation.
Right.
We had to use those. We had to use these quota rations.
We didn't. We could date someone and we could bring to the
I
mother
did.
a big can of cooking oil, remember?
That's
or
right.
even if you really get on in the relationship, you would give her a bicycle. And that
A
was the
friendship
most...
store, remember?
The friendship store, you had to have a quarter to buy a bike, but we as foreign students could jump the quota. But just to put in perspective, Xinmeng is trying to figure out what these ration
Yes, I was
coupons are.
just searching online. So
Online.
this is 粮票, right?
Yes.
Right. So if we can show our audience that it says 1 kilogram. So this is what you use to exchange for food.
No, in addition to money.
The currency.
Yeah, you have to have money
And
plus
the piao,
coupon.
The coupon gives you the right
To
to
spend
use the
money.
money to buy.
Okay.
It's a ration.
Is this the only currency that the food store, state-run food store take?
No, it's not
not a
currency.
currency.
It's not currency.
It's not a currency.
It's your permission to buy.
That's right.
Permission.
So there's rationing, and this is your ration, and you spend your ration on these coupons.
But what if the food is not enough for you?
Then
That's
that's
too
all.
bad.
That's all.
But I first came to live in China in January 1984. And I first came with a company from New Zealand, and I was part of a 2,000 person workforce. I was a worker from New Zealand on a building site. And I would go home to the friends I met, and I remember it was winter of, if you remember, 84 January. It was immensely cold. And I came from a subtropical island, so it's a bit of a shock. The temperature in the house was about 5-6 degrees, because the heating was so poor. And what struck me was the universal poverty, shared poverty. But it wasn't malnutrition. It wasn't the degradation that I later found in visiting other parts of the world, where there were slums, where there were ghettos. There was a universal poverty, but there was nutrition, there was order in food supply, there was oil in most cases. Your coupons, I don't remember, and I came not in the 70s, but there wasn't a lack of products to be procured, and that there was a shared kind of poverty. The one thing that I remember is a friend's mother was opening a cupboard to get something, and in the cupboard were bundles of plastic string and empty plastic bottles, all carefully arrayed, because it was part of the wealth of that household. Now you go to a household, probably the same household, or the grandchildren of that person, and you would find a large apartment with all the electronic appliances and probably a car in the basement. And you talk about pace of change. It took most of our countries hundreds of years to achieve what's occurred in a few decades. It's quite extraordinary.
But that's why I think, a lot of the times the attention is on the economic numbers, on economic growth when we're talking about China. But actually that's why development is not measured only with indicators of GDP. So just to give you another perspective of the speed of development, we development professionals often quote the Human Development Index, which is essentially 3 indices put together from GDP, life expectancy, and education type of measurements. And if you look at China from the 1990s, not even before, when this index was first established globally across all countries, just since then, China passed 31 countries in development that were behind, that China was behind, but not one country passed China that was behind. So that means the speed of development of China is just exponential compared to any other country that may have been developing also during the years, but no other country
That's why up. No matter how you describe it, socialist, communist, capitalist, whatever, it worked.
It worked, definitely.
And the absence of fear, that's the other thing. The insecurity in the 80s was considerable. Would this change? Was there going to be market reforms? What was going to happen? The Gang of Four was still a memory. All that chaos of the 70s after Mao's death. And if I look at one index, the absence of fear, this conversation is something that, given where China was in its uncertainty and closed society in the 80s, is now a huge transformation. And I think that if you can probably include some of those more emotional aspects, this is a country where there are now perhaps a generation and a half. We're worrying about not having enough to eat, worrying about being really suffering from natural disasters. I mean, the terrible floods, the uncontrolled droughts that really affected farmers and people in the countryside in the 80s and 90s. This is abated considerably. So I think the other aspect is the absence of fear in the society.
What do you fear the most, or what does your generation worry about the most?
Actually, in my generation, we don't really fear anything because we weren't born in a generation, the year China's reform and opening up has been done for so long time. So in my generation, our growing environment is very good, actually. So in my generation, we heard most is China's human rights are challenged by the foreign countries in the UN, especially Aggie mentioned the index thing. What we young people understand the human rights is your rights to get access to education, medical care, and transportation, and you have a proper lifestyle, which is absolutely different from my father's generation. We can study abroad. We can choose what sort of any major we want to choose, not just to be controlled by anybody else. We have a proper lifestyle, and we can go out and hang out and speak whatever we want to express. That is the most important thing. China is a very free country, not like the Western media propaganda thing. Young people have no rights to do this, no rights to do that. Actually, we are happy with it. It's a very nice country to live. So,
I know you talk about those rights. I live in a little alleyway in the old part of Beijing. It's kind of like, very narrow labyrinth of alleyways. I can go back at night to my home there. Even after midnight, 1, 2 in the morning, if I'm going back, walking down an alleyway this tight, in the dark, I never think once about the possibility that I might be robbed or assaulted. Now, could you do that in any of the cities in America or in many of the cities of Europe? I don't know. Is it my right to be able to?
I'm afraid of being shot in the United States, but here in Beijing, I've never been afraid. It's very safe and full of security. And when you are taking the tube, you are taking the subway, you are not afraid of any bomb. You are taking a bus, and there are lots of securities inside. Citizens here are happy with it, and people feel secure. This is the
and it's not the presence of the police or the security system. We were both here in the 80s, late 80s, and there was a lot of disturbance and change. What I noticed was when, at the city of Beijing particularly, when the normal governance wasn't in place, the citizens themselves kind of organized well, and things were very, very even. I live quite close to you now, actually. I live near Dongsu, Beidajie, and that labyrinth of hutongs, and I often am walking at night thinking the same thing. And it's because there's a fundamental sense of order. And is that special to the culture? I think when you've been through as much as Chinese people have been through in the last 50 years, 100 years, you've had all the disturbances of the foreign invasions of since the Opium Wars. We can talk about the Opium Wars, right?
Yeah.
The other point being, you think of the horrific times of the Japanese invasion, the Second World War. You think of the Cultural Revolution. You think of it times when individual security in life was something that just seemed so cheap. There's almost a sense of a culture that knows revolution, knows the price of disturbance. So innate to individuals is, let's not use this. Let's not fuel this. Let's keep things not out of fear or subjugation, but let's keep things in order, in moderation. And it's a very strong quality, I think.
Talking about history, just kind of refresh me a little bit. If we think back in after 1949, wasn't China under sanctions? Didn't it have an embargo against it? People couldn't trade with it because the United States viewed it as communist. Wasn't that the case?
Because they'd lost China. I don't know if they thought they had it in the first place. They lost China, so yeah, absolutely.
And it was actually more than that, because 1949, they lost China was one concept. And there was still an attempt to see whether or not the Kuomintang government,
that was your lot, yeah.
to which I belonged, my family belonged, had a chance to come back. And then the Korean War broke out. When that happened, even pharmaceuticals, even medical supplies were blockaded against China. This is how a number of families in Hong Kong became very, very wealthy by bringing supplies, including medical supplies, into China. And this lasted until still today, the Paris Convention. I was on the board of Applied Materials, which is a technology company in California. We had problems, this is even 7-8 years ago, of selling certain technologies to Chinese companies. And you had to get approvals. Now it's even worse. Now it's absolutely absurd with CFIUS.
William, we were talking earlier, and you said something about sanctions. Are sanctions against a country that prevent pharmaceuticals and trade and people's economic development a violation of human rights?
This, I just come to my mind, you know, Dr. Henry Fok?
Yes.
Yes.
He's the one.
That's what I mean. This is who I meant.
The Chinese government never forget
what he did, right?
Who has done good to China. Just like Henry Kissinger and President Nixon. They opened up the frozen relationship between China and US for so many years. At a time of need, they came to China to reopen up. And China always remembers that.
Henry Fok and also Sir Y.K. Pao.
Yeah.
That's right.
President Xi Jinping just did a great reception of Henry Kissinger several days ago. And Kissinger was called the old friend of China for so long time. So actually Chinese do know how to cherish old friends.
There's another old friend, but not as old as Henry Kissinger, Hank Paulson.
Yeah.
And what he said in Singapore I thought was absolutely fascinating. He did talk about opening up, but he said over 100 countries have China as the principal trading partner. If the US continues on this path, the isolation is going to be on the US. It's not going to be on China.
Well, you know, this is about not whether China is capitalist or socialist or communist. This is about one, pragmatism, but also vision, these long-term relationships and seeing things in a sort of 360-degree perspective outward. And it's really about planning, but not planning in the sense of socialism, but long-term strategic planning. That's right. Let's not talk so much about the past as we conclude tonight. Let's talk about the future. Looking ahead, the China economic system. What's it going to look like in the future? William.
I think U.S. made the biggest mistake by assuming China was the imaginative enemy. Imagine China would be the opposite side of the American free enterprise system. China is a system of its own, with Chinese characteristics will, first of all, is to make the world a better place to live for all, not just for China. No selfishness, it's selflessness. We take consideration of helping the poor as well as the ordinary people. That's why I was very impressed. 53 countries out of 54 African countries, they came to China on call of invitation of China's invitation, President Xi Jinping. This is one belt, one road system. They benefit from it. Everybody benefit from it. All the developing countries as well as developed countries. So whether economic systems, Chinese socialist system or free enterprise system, US system, the Chinese has option to make corrections whenever they identify errors or problems. They can make necessary changes in due time. And that's what I think this system is so great, especially the leadership, the anti-corruptions. They thought it's number one poison need to be taken care of, and they did, and people all applause from it. That cheers up the heart of the people.
Donald Trump only talks about only America first, but then President Xi talks about a shared common destiny of mankind. Who's got the vision?
I think for China, it's the world first. Not China first and not America first, and no selfishness, just like William has mentioned. For people all over the world, China is the place to offer experience, offer help to the whole world people, to get people benefit from the fruits of reform and opening up, especially young people. Now you can see Chinese government provides thousands of scholarships towards students from all over the world, not just only developing country students, but also students from the United States, from the United Kingdom. People can come here, study Chinese, get known about the country, and do a better research in the success of China.
The future, what does the economic future look like?
I think we perhaps need to rise above China. And let's look at just 1/5 of us. We're all human beings, beyond culture. And I agree with William that there are some special things going on here. I think that we have a country that, because it is very old, it's got a culture that's very ancient, its way of dealing with crisis is to absorb, not to combat, not to fight. It's not aggressive in its instinct. I mean, sometimes China says aggressive things and makes mistakes, but China will go into the next 10 years absorbing the blows, and it absorbed how many cultures invaded China, the Yuan dynasty, and became Chinese. So I think we're going to see a quieter China. We'll see fewer banner headlines of 25-25 or even Belt and Road. There'll be far less of that. China will find itself in a position where the world is going to go through some very difficult times. We're seeing tectonic shifts that are probably greater than the 20s and 30s. But China will deal with it by being still, by being itself, and focusing on a balanced and harmonious society as far as it can. And that, just by its very nature, will have an influence, and it will help balance the world.
Aggie, you are the UNDP rep in China, and let's talk for a moment about the economic interconnectivity of everything.
That's a big topic you put to me. I maybe leave the economic visioning to the friends here who know about it. But the interconnectedness of it, I think from a human development perspective, because whatever we're talking about, economics and so forth, ultimately is what William said, how does that impact the human beings, us, the human race? And I kind of worry about one thing that nobody talked about. If you think that the change was fast over the last 40 years, I think we don't know what we're up to and up for in the next 10 years. Because I really believe that it's very much underestimated how quickly things will develop. And we're anticipating an economy, a future with the past in mind. And we're not anticipating the future with the future in mind. Just to give you a simple example, I mean, the impact that artificial intelligence will have on our lives, our economies, our jobs, our education, our healthcare system, everything is unprecedented. And the acceleration that it will give to the speed of change that's already very fast, I don't think we are imagining it. So I worry a little bit that in terms of anticipating and adjusting from the Chinese government, but from other governments, is the pace of change is much faster out there than it's in the thinking of the decision makers. So even if China has, in my view, I agree with you, an unbelievable scope of ability to plan for the future, I just fear that globally that's not the trend, but also it does not factor in the speed that we are looking at. So I don't know what others think of it, but I think there's a lot more to think about.
Charles, you have seen the future. Does it work?
I think in terms of the future, there are two aspects. One is the geopolitics side. And the geopolitics side, what is really significant is, I think, Asia rising. It's not just China. It's Asia. It's the rest of Asia coming up. I'm shocked at how quickly Indonesia and Malaysia and other countries are really coming up. I remember 30 years ago, I can claim that, Plaza Accord. What was the Plaza Accord? It was Japan plus 4 little dragons beating out manufacturing in America. But that was only 1/5 of the Asian population. So Plaza Accord, US and a few friends forced Japan to revalue its currency by over 100%, basically brought Japan down to its knees and lost decades. But today, it's not the same. Today, it's all of Asia rising. And if the geopolitics are played properly or correctly, I think we see this now. Less talk from Asians about South China Sea. It's maybe only the US and Australia talking about South China Sea. And the relationship between India and China improving significantly. Abe visiting Beijing. So what I see happening is, okay, Asia will rise. US will decline. Europe depends on where it goes. We don't know. But Africa coming up as the next round. Over 1 billion in population now, and it's developing very rapidly. Africa's rise will only rise with Asia, because as some African ministers of finance said to me, people talk to us about not taking Chinese loans. I'd much rather talk to the Chinese government than talk to Wall Street bankers. We need financing. Do you want to work with Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, or would you rather work with Chinese State Development Bank? There's no comparison. So I think rise of Asia, carry with it Africa. But what will happen to the US and Europe? Je ne sais pas. No idea.
You know, the debate between socialism and capitalism, I frankly think Deng Xiaoping buried this thing back in the 1980s.
White cat, black cat.
Yeah, and
Yes.
we're really looking at pragmatism and what we call now the China solution, which is just a solution going forward. But if you're just going to tell our audience out there around the world one sentence, how would you describe the China economic system today? What is it? William.
Chinese socialism is a economic system with its own way of running. Identify errors. There are plenty of errors, but there are corrections. There are problems, identify the problems, find solutions. That's the Chinese way of doing it.
Xiaoyu.
For me, I want to use just the one word. It's prosperity or prosperous, especially for young people seeking for opportunities from all over the world. This is the new place, new platform for young people to express what they want to do and realize their dreams. That is what Chinese economy is.
Human aspiration in a context of flexible, non-ideological government and management.
Aggie.
Understanding connectivity, connectedness.
Connectedness. Charles.
It's impossible to describe other than just, as you used, one word, pragmatic solutions to solve the problems of 1.4 billion people.
And Ximeng, I think what you said earlier this evening is maybe a good way to end our program.
China is China.
China is China.
It's unique. It's about harmony. Yeah. So we prepared this. We talked about from the past, the history, and we discussed the future. So we prepared this ending segment to wrap up for today's show.